How does addiction change the brain? Well, according to Dr. Gabor Mate, it's a difficult struggle for hardcore drug addicts to kick their habit because their brains are impaired. In a new book, he looks at the common roots of addictive behaviors and what can be done about them. It's called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction. You're known for writing controversial books on subjects as far-ranging as attention deficit disorder, the relationship between stress and disease, and you've done it again, this time with addiction, skirting, challenging conventional wisdoms. How is your take on addiction different than other things that we've heard to date?
Well, it's in everything that I write. I try to look at connections and the overall picture rather than isolating the problem and seeing it as a distinct entity. And addiction is not a problem in itself. It expresses something about people's lives and the nature of the society that we live in, and also about how we develop in a particular environment. So I'm interested in that larger picture, which is what makes my work a little bit different.
For the last decade, you've been working in the notorious East End of Vancouver with hardcore drug users, and you tell many of the stories of patients, people you worked with in your new book. How did that experience influence the way you look at addiction today as a researcher?
For one thing, when you actually work with people daily, addiction takes on a human face. And when you talk to people about their lives, you get that addiction is the end point of a long process suffused by suffering from early childhood on. And for another, if you're open to yourself, you get to see that you're not that different. I'm not that different from the people that I work with. I'm more fortunate in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of fundamental dynamics that I can recognize and resonate with. So really, it takes away the otherness of the addict.
Now, let's get into that a little bit more, because this is, I think, would be surprising for most people, because one of the major theses of the book is that addiction isn't an absolute thing. It's a continuum, and that hardcore drug use is at one end, but it's only at one end. Explain that further and give me examples of what else is in there.
Sure. Well, my definition of addiction is any behavior that has negative consequences, but a person continues to crave it and relapse into it despite those negative consequences. And if you look at it from that point of view, there are many addictive behaviors in our culture. If you look at it from the point of view of brain physiology, which we can get into, the shopaholic and the workaholic, they're trying to excite and release the same brain chemicals that the drug addict is after. So both from the point of view of behavior and psychological dynamics and brain biology, there's only one addiction process. At the extreme end of that scale is the substance user who's injecting heroin and cocaine. But 30% of adults in Canada between 19 and 64 years of age define themselves as workaholics, which is to say they feel listless and unhappy when they're not working, and they ignore their families for the sake of the kick, the adrenaline and dopamine kick they get out of work.
Now, I want to get into that also, what that leads to. But first, in your own circumstance, I mean, your books have always been confessional in part, and you talk about your own compulsive behavior. In this instance, purchasing, an addiction to purchasing classical CDs. That seems pretty harmless. Tell me about how bad it got.
Well, it is harmless compared to the addictions of my clients who are dying of HIV and hepatitis C and overdoses. And my workaholism and my compact disc addiction wouldn't register on the Richter scale in comparison with theirs. But while the differences are obvious, it's the similarities that are interesting. There's that compulsion to get something right away. So I'll drop everything and I'll run down to the store and I have to have this particular disc right now. So I ignore somebody who's in labor and a patient of mine. I'll go down to the store to buy a disc. I'll spend $8,000 in a week, I did once, not because I made a conscious choice to do so, but because I was compelled to keep going back, thinking that just one more will do it for me.
Now,
but let me just say say that if I look at the negative impact, the negative impact is that I lie to my wife. In other words, I undermine a relationship with my spouse because addiction almost automatically brings shame and dishonest behavior. And I'll ignore my kids.
The root cause and the consequences, while perhaps not as deleteriously, are directionally the same.
Absolutely. And it's, for the family, I mean, what does a kid feel like when his father is with him, but he's actually just thinking about his next purchase?
Now, we're all aware that there are these other addictions, but drug addiction in particular seems to be stigmatized by society. Why is that?
I think there's a huge mind split there, because on the one hand, tobacco smoke kills 5.5 million people around the world every year. In other words, as many people are killed by the perfectly legal and freely advertised activity of tobacco smoke as were killed in the Nazi genocide in the whole course of the Second World War. So for what reason we decide that heroin is a more dangerous drug than tobacco, I have no idea. And I'm not even talking about alcohol. I think that as a society, we tend to want to create an other on whom we can lay our sins and the things we don't like about ourselves and kind of separate it from ourselves. So really, I think it's a scapegoat phenomenon. I think we're in a highly addicted culture. We don't like to look at the extremity of that addiction, which is the substance user, so we ostracize and marginalize them.
And you think that actually adds to the problem of the addicts?
Well, what did we do with Prohibition except create Al Capone and the Chicago mob? I mean, the illegality and the negative behaviors of the drug addict arise mostly out of the illegality of the activity, not because of the very nature of the activity.
Now, we often hear about an addiction gene,
Yeah.
the notion that addicts are born,
Yeah.
not made. You reject this.
Well, there's simply no science behind it, or at least the science behind it is laughably illogical. And the assumptions that it's based on is that genes determine things. But first of all, nobody's ever identified a specific addiction gene for anything. Although there might be some genetic predispositions for certain traits that can lead to addiction, for the most part, genes are turned on and off by the environment. If I planted a seed of wheat on this table here, it wouldn't grow. There's nothing here that would turn on those genes to make that plant thrive. It's the same with human beings. And so most of brain development occurs under the impact of the environment, beginning in uterus. If you stress animals or human mothers during pregnancy, their offspring will be more likely to have addictive behaviors as adults. Not to mention the well-known fact that most substance abusers were themselves abused as children.
Well, this is a big thesis, or part of the thesis of virtually everything I think you've written, is that
Yeah.
early childhood development is incredibly important, period. And in this instance, what goes on in early childhood can make you more prone to addiction. Explain that.
Well, you know, there was a study in California that looked at 17,000 adults, half of whom had been to college, 30% of whom had completed college. In that population, they looked at what they called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs they called them, such as abuse in the family, a child being hit or sexually abused, a parent being hit by another parent, addiction in the family. If a child had 6 of those adverse childhood experiences, his chance of becoming a substance user was 4,600% greater than that of a child who did not have those experiences in childhood. Because what happens is that the early experience actually shapes the brain.
Neurologically, the brains develop in a different way based on the behavioral context.
Absolutely. The structures of the brain, the chemicals in the brain, the transmitters in the brain, the circuits are all defined and shaped by the environment. If you do a scan of women who are depressed and were sexually abused as kids, and you look at the scan of women who are depressed but they weren't sexually abused, there's a difference based on the fact that these women were sexually abused. In other words, early experiences, and I don't have a single patient, by the way, in the downtown east side, a single female patient who was not sexually abused as a child. Not one, not even by accident have I met one. And that's completely in line with the statistics. So early experiences powerfully shape the brain, plus they create the lifelong emotional pain that the drug then comes along to soothe. So from my point of view, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain.
It seems that given that notion, then using drugs is self-medication.
Which is what it is. So many people will tell me that I use crystal meth or I use cocaine, it calms me down. You know what they're telling me? They're telling me they have an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder because taking a stimulant will calm that person down. So people are medicating ADHD. People are self-medicating depression with their drugs.
Well, now this is where it gets really controversial,
Yeah.
because that says that it's really not a matter of choice then, is it? It's survival.
It's not a whole lot of choice. You know, the problem in drug addiction is not the free will, but the free won't. Their brains cannot say no because the circuitry is so empty and so full of craving for that release and that soothing and that diminishing of stress, that when that child, and usually addiction starts in teenagehood, that child does drug for the first time, they feel calm and together like they've never have in their whole life. And in that moment, they're hooked. And that's a susceptible person.
So then this certain brain circuitry lends itself to an addictive personality more than others.
Yeah.
The other brain research that's fascinating in this book is what happens to the addicted brain. This is after the fact. Talk to me about that.
Sure. Well, chronic alcohol use or chronic cocaine or heroin use, it'll stop brain development. which will further diminish the power of choice, of course. So now a damaged brain has to make a choice to heal. This is the dilemma that we're facing here. And so if you look at the gray matter or the white matter in the brains of chronic users, you'll see characteristic changes in failure of development corresponding to the length of use.
That's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle. The more you use, the more brain damage you sustain.
Most people look to examples of, addiction seems to run in families.
It does.
Or even runs in communities.
It does.
Give your thesis an explanation of those kind of conclusions.
Well, we have a very tragic case control experiment here in Canada with our First Nations population. There were addictive substances in North America before the coming of the Caucasians. In some areas there was alcohol, there was peyote, there was tobacco, there was no addiction. If addiction was genetic, those people should have been addicted. What happens is, of course, if you traumatize people, if you disempower them, if you take away their spiritual place in the universe, if you deprive them of meaning and dignity, if you take away their ways of making a living, if you destroy their communities and you keep this going for generations, then the need for soothing and relief becomes entrenched in those communities. And the trauma is passed on from one generation to the next because parenting styles are inherited not genetically, but biologically and behaviorally and psychologically from one generation to the next. So that means that now we have a highly traumatized population. 50 to 60% of our jail population is Aboriginal Canadians, even though they only make up 2 or 3% of the population.
The same with your patient caseload.
Exactly. 30% of my clients in the downtown east side are Aboriginal Canadians. And it's not because of any genetic predisposition. It's because of what's happened to them. So that things can go on in a family and pass it on from one generation to the next because you create the same conditions. It's got nothing to do with genes.
Now, this has also, I would think, huge implications in public policy, because what you're saying, in essence, is that drugs aren't addictive, that there is an addictive personality.
Well, drugs aren't addictive to the person not predisposed to become addicted. You give most people morphine for pain relief, and it doesn't matter how high doses you use, they'll never become addicted. Once the pain is gone, they stop the morphine. A very small percentage will become actually addicted because they're predisposed. The example I give in the book is the American Army in Vietnam, where 20% of the GIs at the end of the war who came back were actually addicted to heroin. Within a few years, only 1% was. Which means that if the drug was intrinsically addicted, those people should have stayed addicts. But they didn't. Once the stress of the war was over, only the most susceptible amongst them.
You use, I think, a very apt analogy about gambling.
Well, yeah, I mean, nobody argues that a pack of cards causes gambling addiction, or if that food causes food addiction, or that the availability of open stores causes shopping addiction. So there has to be a predisposition, and that predisposition is set, again, according to early stress.
Now, but this, and again, it's a nuance that I think is really, really important in terms of the research, but maybe not understood immediately. You're saying that, addiction is not in the genes, but it is in our biology.
Yeah, that's right. And genes don't equate, in other words, biology does not mean genes. And again, when it comes to plants or animals, people get that point really easily. Everybody knows that how you treat a little dog, a puppy, will have a huge impact on the kind of personality that dog will have when he grows up to be an adult. Or if you had a plant in your garden that wasn't growing well, you wouldn't yell at it and scream at it to grow up, would you? You would say, well, what are the conditions here? With human beings, we seem to think that these conditions are not that important, that it's all genetically determined, and I think it's a cop-out. I think it's our way as a society not to take responsibility for how we raise our kids, how we support parents, how we look after minorities, what possibilities we offer people.
Now, a lot of your thinking and the research that you've drawn upon has gone into the creation of the safe injection sites that we're seeing starting to be experimented with. The critics say, "Oh, this is normalizing drug use. This doesn't deal with recovery. This basically just it allows someone to continue to be an addict." How do you respond to those critics?
Well, first of all, nobody needs to be allowed to continue to be an addict. People will continue to be an addict no matter what you do, if they're going to continue to be an addict. The question is, should you help people reduce the harm from the addiction? In other words, should they use dirty needles and pass HIV and hepatitis C onto each other, or should we give them clean needles? If they overdose, should we resuscitate them, or should we let them die? Now, nobody argues that a workaholic business executive who suffers a heart attack should not get quadruple bypass surgery because it only encourages workaholism. Nobody argues that a smoker whose lungs are inflamed and the airways are narrowed should not be given medication to open up the airways and reduce inflammation so he can prolong his life and have a better quality of life. Nobody argues that a person who's got diabetes because they didn't exercise enough and ate too much shouldn't get insulin. Why the heck are we arguing? Why is it even a question? In other words, harm reduction is what we do in medicine. Most conditions are chronic, and most of the time what we do is reduce the harm. Now, a safe injection site, it's a very small step. It doesn't cure addiction. It's not meant to. It's meant to reduce the harm. But it's also a place where people can have compassionate medical care for the first time in their lives. And I work at a facility where we take people into detox from inside. In other words, people who meet medical staff for the first time and nurses and counselors for the first time who speak to them non-judgmentally are now able to take the step of moving towards recovery. So you have to meet people where they are at.
Okay, let's say I come back to you and say, okay, I can see how it would be beneficial to the addict.
Yeah.
Is there an argument of the public interest about safe injections?
Well, yes. It means that fewer people are injecting in the streets. It means that fewer people are falling down in the streets. It means that fewer people are getting diseases that cost tremendous amounts of dollars to try and manage in the future. So there's only benefit and there's no downside. The opposition to these harm reduction measures is not based on any science or logic. It's based purely on a kind of fundamentalist moral judgment that drug addiction is bad and other addictions are okay, but this addiction is somehow morally reprehensible. It's a judgment.
Yeah. In exactly the same way. I mean, your research has led you to conclude that the war on drugs, at least as it's waged right now, is wrong-headed and will ultimately fail. Why so?
Well, you know, first of all, it's been going on for many, many decades, and we're not seeing any results. In fact, we're seeing worsening of the problem everywhere you look. In the United States, which is the leader of the war on drugs internationally, and which imposes its views on other countries quite brutally, actually, leads the world. The Americans make up 5% of the world's population. They make up 25% of the world's jail population. There's one or more Americans in jail for every 100 Americans alive. That's a very unenviable statistic. And most of those people are in jail because of drug-related issues. In other words, we create this huge crime problem by making something illegal that people... There's an American judge who said that trying to repeal the law of supply and demand is like trying to repeal the law of gravity. Yes, by all means, we should deal with addiction, but you can't do it punitively, and you can't do it administratively. You have to do it through a compassionate and scientific-based approach.
This has led you further to conclude that really what we should be doing, rather than spending all of this money on enforcement and criminalizing drug behavior, that we should actually legalize it.
Not legalize it, decriminalize it.
Okay.
Yeah. Legalization would mean that we'd have a situation like tobacco, where people are getting profits of the deaths of 5 million people a year. We wouldn't want that now, would we? That's what legalization would mean. I'm talking about decriminalization, where the possession for personal use of these drugs would no longer be a crime, and where the drugs of dependence are actually supplied to people under health supervision to confirm that.
Even really hard, dangerous drugs like crystal meth?
Well, you know, there's all kinds of details that I probably don't have time to go into here. Crystal meth is an interesting side issue, and I believe we could be managing it a lot better. Even then, I would say that I'd like to find a way of at least giving people pure crystal meth if they're going to use it rather than the adulterated, poisonous stuff that they inject in the streets. But I think we could get rid of crystal meth use really, really quickly with some more enlightened medical treatments. I don't think that's such a big issue. But certainly cocaine and heroin. And that would also give us an opportunity to bring people into care so that they have a much better chance of giving up their addiction. You see, if we want people to make the choice to give up their addiction, we first of all have to de-stress them. The research is unequivocal that the biggest driver for relapse and addictive behaviors is stress itself.
And this again goes back to the brain condition, isn't it?
Absolutely. When people's cortisol levels are high, and cortisol is the body's stress hormone, they're much more likely to use a drug to try and soothe their stresses. Now, when you stress a large population by ostracizing, marginalizing, and criminalizing them, you're stressing them. You can't possibly hope to rehabilitate large numbers of them. And so, not to mention the fact that I tell this story in the book of this patient of mine who tells me that he uses $100 of cocaine a day. Of course, how do you raise $100 a day? Well, you shoplift. But you don't shoplift $100 a day because you don't get $1 to 1, you get $1 to the 10. So in order to raise $100 a day for cocaine, he shoplifts $1,000 a day's worth of goods, which means in a month, $30,000, which means in a year, $360,000.
That's a lot of money.
Per person.
Right.
What if we actually save that money and put it into some humane programs?
Now, what would the system look like? Would it look like the Liquor Control Board of Ontario?
No, because they're still selling it in an uncontrolled kind of way to anybody who wants it,
Right.
and so on. No, we would look more like the heroin clinics that they've had in the UK and other countries, Switzerland.
Is there evidence in those jurisdictions where that's been tried, that it leads to greater drug use, that it basically normalizes drug use?
No, the evidence is to the contrary. The evidence is that HIV transmission goes down, crime goes down, employability goes up. In Holland, where marijuana is legal, they have much less pot problem they do in the United States, where the laws against pot are draconian. So that any pieces of evidence that you can gather about decriminalization and supervised provision is in favor of the practice, and there's no evidence against it.
Probably the most successful treatment system is Alcoholic Anonymous 12 steps. And in it, one of the steps, says you must own the problem and you must want to change.
Yes.
This suggests that there is a huge element of individual choice involved in recovery. You buy that?
I totally buy it. There's a balance between the brain's automatic mechanisms and then the brain's capacity to make independent choice. The question we have to ask is, what will promote a person's capacity to make independent choice? So the more compassionate care we can give to people, the more we enhance their capacity to be responsible and to make those choices and to take those 12 steps.
So what does the evidence say about why one individual recovers and another doesn't?
That's always a very difficult question. It certainly has got nothing to do with negative consequences, hitting bottom, anything like that, because what the bottom is for one person is not the bottom for another.
Okay.
For my patients, haven't hit bottom already. They have HIV, they have multiple infections, they have brain abscesses, spinal abscesses, joint infections, the death of friends, the loss of family, the loss of income, marginalization, degradation, and they still don't give it up. What negative consequence can we pile onto them?
That's very interesting, because the point you make is that your patients don't see themselves as having an illness. They don't retreat to this notion that this is an incurable disease. How do they see themselves and their addiction?
Well, these people are deeply ashamed of themselves. And although they will say that it's a way of forgetting, and it's a way of getting away from experiences that they just don't want to even think about. And really the stories are horrendous as to what happened to them. Mostly they blame themselves. Mostly they see themselves as flawed people. Mostly they see themselves as failures.
So the same kind of societal stigma is something that they internalize.
You see, when you abuse a child, the child's brain usually concludes that there must be something deeply wrong with me, or else this wouldn't have happened to me. That's what happens when children are mistreated. The other thing that happens is that their eyes go dead. They become emotionally shut down as a way of protecting themselves. So they're no longer alive to their own needs. So we're talking about people who are emotionally traumatized and who have a deep sense of shame about their very existence. By ostracizing them further, by adding to the shame, we simply entrench them again in the need to get away from that shame by using drugs. And for a moment, you feel on top of the world.
One of the most shocking things you say about your own work is that really what you're doing is palliative care.
Yeah.
That in terms of the hardcore drug users you have to deal with, the prospect of recovery is very, very small.
The statistics would be that maybe 1 or 2 or 3% of my patients will ever give up their addiction. Most of them will die before they're 50 or in their early 50s of a whole range of diseases or overdose.
And as a society, is that something we just have to live with?
No, we're doing this. This is how it is right now. It'd be very easy to conceptualize a society which is much more caring and much more compassionate, where resources that are not devoted to this useless and traumatic war on drugs, and by the way, there's no war on drugs, there's only a war on drug addicts. I mean, you can't war on inanimate objects. And the people that we're warring on are the people that are most abused. We're punishing people for having abused as children. The cops who try to save kids from being abused and who are very compassionate towards a traumatized child will 20 years later throw up that traumatized child against an alley wall and frisk him and beat him up perhaps, because he's a drug user and a drug dealer. So that we could envision a whole system of care at much less expense than what we're spending right now, in which people could be help to transform themselves, but under present circumstances, there's no hope.
What about all those people? I mean, if addiction, as you say, is a continuum, what do you tell the average person who has maybe less or a more socially acceptable addictions? What kind of advice do you have for our viewers about this entire subject?
A person who, like myself, successful and status and all that, but has an addictive tendency, which is very powerful in me, and which is real negative consequences in my life, at a certain point I have to get that ain't worth it. That, yeah, I get a kick out of work and being busy and people wanting me, but what's the impact? A loss of myself, loss of inner peace, loss of contact with my family, undermining my relationship with my spouse of 38 years. And that my little ego, which wants all these things and hold on to everything, really is powerless in the face of the addicted drive. Like they say in the first step group, we recognize that we're powerless. Yeah, you got to get it. And then the ego never wants to admit that it's powerless. But we have to get to the point where we say, yeah, we're powerless. And really appeal to that higher part of ourselves that wants more peace, wants more togetherness, wants more humanity, wants more connection. When you get the powerlessness, and when you get the possibility of a different way of being, then there's a whole set of steps you can follow, which I write about in the book, which the 12-step groups recommend in their own particular way. But that's the first step. And to get that much of what our society holds out to people, which is all about acquisition, which is all about how we look to others, which is all about attainment. Those values are actually never ones that will ever satisfy the real need of the human soul for connection and meaning.
Gabor Mate, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure, thank you.